Hey everybody, welcome back to another video on the channel, and today's video, as you guys see by the title, is that the PlayStation 5 has been leaked to actually be more powerful than the Xbox Series X. So this is a leak, so just keep that in mind, but this is what we're going to be talking about in today's video. So before we get into it, I want to remind you guys to subscribe to the channel if you're not already. You guys stay up to date with all the latest and greatest videos regarding the Xbox Series X, PlayStation 5, and any other content we put up on the channel. We've got a lot of great stuff in the works, so make sure you're subscribed with that notification bell ring. That way you guys stay up to date. But let's get into the topic of today's video, and that's that the PlayStation 5 has been leaked to actually be more powerful than the Xbox Series X. So this just comes from 4chan. It's a leak from 4chan, so that in and of itself is a little iffy, and personally, I'm a little bit skeptical on this whole leak, but I thought it was interesting nonetheless, and I wanted to share it with you guys to get your guys' opinion on this. But this leak from 4chan, this is what it shows. It has a little graph, and it shows that the PlayStation 5 will have a 12.6 teraflop RDNA 1.5 GPU, a Zen 2 CPU at 3.6 gigahertz. It'll have 18 gigabytes of GDDR6 RAM, plus an extra 4 gigabytes of DDR4 RAM. It will have an SSD at 5.5 gigabytes per second, and it'll be a 500 gigabyte capacity drive. For visuals and sound, it says it'll have dedicated cores for ray tracing and 3D audio. And then the bandwidth of the system, between like memory and such, is going to be 576 gigabytes per second, okay? Now you compare that to the Xbox Series X, and this person's leak for the Xbox Series X says you'll have an 11.8 teraflops RDNA 1.5 GPU, an AMD Zen 2 CPU at 3.7 gigahertz. It'll have 16 gigabytes of GDDR6 memory and an extra 4 gigabytes of DDR4. It'll have an SSD at 3.8 gigabytes a second, but it'll be a 1 terabyte drive, and it'll have dedicated RT cores, but it'll be less than the PlayStation 5, and its bandwidth is going to be 596 gigabytes per second. So what's interesting is that these leaks don't even line up with the ones we've gotten previously. Previously, we got a pretty big leak about the specs behind the PlayStation 5, basically saying it was going to be something around a 9 teraflop GPU in the PlayStation 5, and the Xbox Series X is going to be sitting at right about 12. And we got specific leaks also about the Xbox Series X, saying that it's going to have a CPU running at 3.6 gigahertz. It's going to have a 12 teraflop RDNA Navi GPU. It's going to have 16 gigabytes of RAM, with 13 of it is going to be going for games, and 3 of it's going to be kind of reserved for the system and whatnot. But this leak is totally changing all that. So it says it'll have an 11.8 teraflops RDNA 1.5 GPU, but it says that the CPU is going to be getting an extra 100 megahertz on this, so a 3.7 gigahertz CPU. But something I found interesting is their RAM setup here, is that this leak is claiming that the Xbox Series X is going to have essentially 20 gigabytes of total RAM capacity, and the PlayStation 5 is going to have 22 gigabytes of RAM. And I find that really hard to believe. Most good gaming PCs just have straight up like 16 gigabytes of RAM, and honestly don't really even need that unless you have like a bunch of applications open. You're playing a game, you got like Spotify, you got Chrome open, and a bunch of other things open on your computer. You don't really need 16 gigabytes of RAM, but apparently the PlayStation 5 is just going to have 22 gigabytes of RAM. I think that's very unlikely, especially because of the price of RAM at this time. And also, why would a PlayStation 5 need that much RAM? I don't think games are going to use more than like 16 gigabytes of RAM. But it's interesting though that these leaks don't even line up from ones we've gotten previously. So this really leads me to believe that this is a fake leak. Also, another thing interesting about it though is that it says we'll have a 1 terabyte SSD at 3.8 gigabytes a second. Previously we heard that the SSD in the Xbox Series X was going to be maybe around 2 gigabytes per second, which is pretty standard for SSDs, but 3.8? Okay. And then the PlayStation 5 is going to be a 5.5 gigabytes per second SSD? What? I mean, it could line up with some of the leaks we've gotten previously, that Samsung is in partnerships with Sony, and Sony will have a Samsung SSD within the PlayStation 5, and Samsung's going to be releasing the brand new 980 Pro, and it's going to have read and write speeds up to 6,500 and 5,000 megabytes per second. So it could be pretty accurate that, yeah, the PlayStation 5 might use this, but then again, this is like a very, very high-end like desktop drive, and so for this to come into a PlayStation 5 makes me very, very skeptical. And then also for the fact that it's only going to be a 500 gigabyte drive. I've talked about this on some Xbox Series X videos in the past, but I think that capacities for these new systems are going to start at 1 terabyte. I don't think that they can go like another generation starting at 500 gigabytes. Yeah, like sure, it's going to be an SSD, and SSDs are like crazy fast and a lot better than mechanical hard drives in basically every way. But if we're going to have the same exact capacity as a console that launched in 2013, that doesn't really seem like a step up. I would still expect at least 1 terabyte to be the minimum. That way you get a step up, but it's also not absurd and it's not like just absolutely breaking the bank. Because a lot of games nowadays are reaching upwards of like 100 gigabytes. And if you have just a 500 gigabyte system, like you can only install a handful of games on that. And even 1 terabyte, you know, honestly isn't enough for like 10 plus games. So that's another red flag there for me. It says the Xbox Series X will have dedicated RT cores, but there's going to be less than the PlayStation 5. The PlayStation 5 is going to have more RT cores than the Xbox Series X, so that's kind of strange. The Xbox Series X does have an advantage by having more bandwidth, so it has 596 gigabytes per second as compared to the PlayStation 5's 576, and also has an extra 100 megahertz on the CPU, so apparently it's going to use like the exact same CPU in both systems. But I think it's so weird that apparently the PlayStation 5 is now going to be a 12.6 teraflop GPU, like right after we heard that the Xbox Series X is going to have around a 12 teraflop GPU. So all in all, I think this is just really like wishful thinking on behalf of some PlayStation fan. If you've kept up to date with the PlayStation 5 so far, we've heard a bunch of leaks and stuff about the actual specs of PlayStation 5 going back almost a year now, and they've been pretty consistent, but all of a sudden this leak comes out and it's supposed to be dramatically different. And to be honest with you, this isn't the way things are going to work. Sony isn't going to be able to magically, within like a 2 or 3 month span, just all of a sudden, bam, now we got a 12.6 teraflop GPU in the system. We're going to have 22 gigabytes of RAM, and this, it's going to be amazing. It's going to have more RT cores and stuff. It's 100% impossible for Sony to make all these changes and do all this stuff in like a 3 month span, especially when we're this close to launch. Like, I know we're probably like 8 or 9 months away from launch, but Sony actually really does have to get all these specs nailed down well in advance and start actually manufacturing the system very soon. But also they got to get all these specs down because they've already sent out dev kits to developers to develop games for this system. So they can't just like change specs all willy-nilly. They can't be like, oh yeah, no, the GPU is going to be a 12 teraflop GPU now. Like, oh sorry, we're going to send out brand new dev kits now. Throw away all the old ones. We're sending you new dev kits with a better GPU in it. Like, no, they're not going to do all that. Whatever they like sent the developers, that's pretty much final. They're not going to be making huge radical changes like this close to launch, because these systems get planned out years and years in advance. This whole concept seems very strange for us to be getting like a 12.6 teraflop GPU. It's going to have more RT cores. It's going to have 22 gigabytes of RAM. And honestly, if this is all the case, yeah, maybe it's real, but the console's going to cost like $700-800 if this is all true. If this leak is actually accurate, you can bet your butt that the PlayStation 5 won't sell for $1 under $500. It could sell for $500 and Sony could take $200 loss on every single system, but I guarantee you, if these are accurate, it will not be below $500. And honestly, I don't see Sony doing that. I don't see Sony releasing a console for $500. I feel like $400 is the sweet spot for Sony with their PlayStation 4. That's what it launched at. And the PlayStation 4 Pro also launched at $400. And I don't think Sony needs to have the most powerful console. Sony's already kind of demonstrated this last generation that you don't need to have the most powerful console to be successful. I mean, they've sold over 100 million PlayStation 4s, and I think a large part it's due to it being $400 or less. There's definitely an appeal for the Xbox One X to be the most powerful console, but it also is $500, but you know, it does go on sale, but $500, like still, for some people that's too much to pay for a console. I feel like $400 and below is the sweet spot. $400 for like base retail price, but then also dropping out $50, maybe even $100 on sales is a great thing, and that's why I think the PlayStation 5 is going to launch at $400. I think that 9 teraflop GPU leak was pretty accurate for the PlayStation 5, and honestly, I think that's enough for this next generation system. I don't think that we need 12 teraflops of GPU power. It'd be nice, but it's also going to make the system more expensive. I don't think we need 22 gigabytes of RAM. And I also find it strange that we're going to have GDDR6 plus DDR4. That seems strange, especially considering like previous gen consoles, the PlayStation 4 and the PlayStation 4 Pro, they just had GDDR RAM. They didn't have DDR4 in it or DDR3. The Xbox One was a little bit weird because that had like a little bit of like ESRAM in it. Had kind of a weird setup, but Microsoft saw their mistake there and totally ditched it and just made it straight up GDDR RAM in the Xbox One X. So for my final thoughts on this, I think that this is fake. I think this is wishful thinking on some PlayStation fan. They really want the PlayStation 5 to be the most powerful console ever. They don't like the idea of Microsoft having a more powerful console. But honestly, I think that's just Microsoft's MO. Microsoft wants to still have that title, the most powerful console, but Sony doesn't need that. I said this before. Sony is okay being in second in terms of power. And that's just fine because you know what? It's going to be able to make their console cheaper. They can launch a console at $400 and have a 9 teraflop GPU. So I should mention this real quick. All this comes from Windows Central. I'll have that linked in the description. But in Windows Central's article, one of the last things they mention here is, does it matter whether the Xbox Series X or the PlayStation 5 is more powerful? And I think that's a great question. Does it actually matter whether or not the PlayStation 5 is more powerful or if it's weaker? No. The answer is no. It doesn't matter. Something I've heard a lot from PlayStation fans, basically ever since the Xbox One X came out, is that, yeah, power is all cool, but you know what really sells a console is games. I mean, case in point is like the Nintendo Switch. In comparison to the Xbox and PlayStation, the Nintendo Switch is very weak, but it also has sold millions of systems because it has great games on it. Windows Central mentions that for the average consumer at the end of the day, it really comes down to price and also value. And as much as everybody wants to have the most powerful system, sure, you can have a PC with a RTX 2080 Ti in it, and it'd be way more powerful than the Xbox Series X or PlayStation 5. But you know what? There's PCs out there that are even more powerful than that. Heck, if you really cared about having the most powerful system, yeah, you could just go and drop $9,000 on a Quadro GV100, or you could drop $5.5 grand on a Quadro RTX 8000. But nobody's going to do that because it's not a great value. People care about value and about games. So honestly, at the end of the day, it doesn't matter if the PlayStation 5 is weaker or it might be more powerful. It doesn't really matter. The thing that matters is that we are going to have competition here, and that will force innovation, and that's what's great for the consumer. So I'm going to hear your guys' thoughts on this in the comments down below. What do you guys think about this so-called PlayStation 5 12 teraflop GPU leak? You guys have heard my opinion. I want to hear yours. Do you think it's real, or do you think it's just wishful thinking? Let me know in the comments down below, and let me know your guys' thoughts on this video as a whole. And I want to thank you guys so much for watching. I truly do appreciate it, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.